Hey, John.
Hi there.
Nice haircut.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. How are things in Colorado?
Um, it's an absolutely beautiful day. Maybe we can take a pause at some point and I can show you the mountain in my backyard that goes up to almost 5,000 meters.
Wow. How long have you been living in Colorado?
I've been here since the late 70s.
Okay. And
And
prior to that?
before that, I was a university professor for a brief time in the Midwest. And then I was based out of uh, Washington, D.C., and I did a lot of time in the Appalachians. I had a mountain farm up there. And then in New York, I began doing my work ecologically in New York City. It seems kind of a strange place to be doing that, but I did.
That was my question. New York is probably the farthest you get from, the Californian vibe and the ecological work.
Frankly, I think I mentioned in our last podcast that when I got started with a lot of this, there was no environmental movement. So a lot of my early work was to help with the creation of the environmental movement. I'm probably one of the relatively few survivors of that period in the late 50s and early 60s when we gave birth to a lot of this stuff, a small group of us. And to do that, I joined a foundation called the Conservation Foundation, and that was based in New York. I was lucky to get to work and with an organization that was so open to looking on how do we create a whole system type of awareness in the culture. It actually had a very strong philosophical foundation. It wasn't just about law and economics and things of that sort. It was very much involved in things like the what is the philosophical foundation for a renewed perspective towards man's relationship to the earth. And I love that. And that really gave me the context to work hard on coming up with the languaging of how we can have a whole system type of awareness, which became the environmental movement brand in a sense, and then shifted awareness from resource-based perspective of just taking from nature to a basis that saw ourselves as an integral part of nature and learning how to become a responsible members of a large living system.
Before or after you explored all the different Eastern traditions, and you mentioned that in our conversations earlier that you had visited Nepal, Bhutan, Himalayas, and so on. And was this while you were the professor, or was it after this?
That's a very good question. I really began doing my work in places like Nepal, Tibet, Bhutan, uh, India. I think my first deep immersion over there was in 1968 when I went over to Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia and Laos as the leader of a team of ecologists and biologists to look into the potential impacts of building 50 dams along the mainstream Mekong. So that experience got me very deep into Southeast Asian culture, especially in those countries. And then from there, I was invited to come to Bhutan, where I was one of the early Westerners from the outside world allowed to come into the country. Very hard to get into in those days. And I was invited by the royal family of Bhutan to take a look at a number of development proposals from the World Bank and the UNDP, which proposed things like cutting down the forests to turn them into artificial fiber, and that unfolded a whole nother story, which I'd be glad to share a little bit about. But and then I ended up doing quite a bit of deep work in Nepal during the 70s and helping with the national park system and its unfoldment, and also looking into how community-based systems of agriculture and reforestation could reverse the process of environmental degradation, which was pretty rampant in those days. And again, I worked a little bit with the royal family at that time because it was still, most of the programs were done under what they called HMG, His Majesty's government. And that work in Nepal exposed me to a number of traditions, Hindu traditions, Tibetan traditions, and I went deep into both. And then some shamanic traditions as well, like the Bunpo.
And so, which of these traditions that you have worked with have had like the deepest sort of influence on you? Could you give us a view of how the different traditions have played out in your journey?
Sure. I think one of the, as I mentioned last time, I spent um, a big chunk of time in the late 60s, uh, late 50s, early 60s in Yucatan with a Lacandon shaman whose name was Bor, and lived with him and his family, and really had a deep exposure to the shamanism related to the rainforests of Central America. An amazing experience. After that, with this exposure to some of the Asian philosophical systems, and also before that, I began to study in some of the Taoist systems. I was lucky enough to have a number of masters from Taoism, especially from Qigong and Tai Chi backgrounds and Taoist internal alchemy. I showed up in Washington, D.C., and I began working in D.C. around 63. And shortly thereafter, I began studying Tai Chi and Qigong and bringing those understandings into my exposure to how, at least in China, the Chinese perspective viewed nature. And I was very impressed with how integrated the Taoist systems were in providing a very integrated perspective of humans and nature being one entity, and also how the healing power of nature was critical in coming back into balance with one's own essential nature and solving some of the problems of internal discord, unhappiness, and anxiety that I so many people were suffering with even in those days. Whereas Taoism gave many of the clues to how to come back into balance and harmony with the elements and with the rest of life. So I went very deep into Taoism as a core practice personally.
Hmm.
And then I began to see that had a great value in the people I was putting out on wilderness retreats and on vision quests. So I began including those Taoist practices as a foundation for preparing people to go out into solitude and nature. And I was doing that, of course, all through the 50s and 60s. So I began to integrate that as a preparation for going out and being alone in nature in a deep way. Then after I went to Southeast Asia and worked on the Mekong project and began to blow some whistles on the potential environmental impacts of that, I had a very deep exposure to some of the Buddhist cultures of Southeast Asia and back in the States with Zen culture. So I took a deep dive into Zen Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism from Southeast Asia, which really had focused a lot on things like Vipassana, mindfulness training. And again, after going deep into that with a number of teachers, for example, I studied with Mr. Goenka and his wife in Vipassana. They had a series of seminars they were doing in Nepal in those days. So I trained directly under them in mindfulness practice. So I began bringing some of these kinds of things into the way of nature process as a foundation for meditative stabilization and opening, which then allowed people to go much deeper into the connection with nature because their minds were very present. They were they constantly caught up in busy-minded distractions and contractions. They could focus much more clearly on being in nature and being there with the rest of life. And I also took the mindfulness type of practice and gave it a little different focus. I think instead of closing down the senses, I began exploring with opening up the senses, which I'd learned from some of my shamanic background and shamanism teachers. And through that, I learned to honor the senses and actually to follow the senses both into the connection with the outer realities of trees and flowers and plants and rocks and what have you. And also following those experiences through my senses back into where they arose at the deepest level internally. So I discovered that if you followed all the senses back into where they arose internally, they could actually begin to open up a view into your true nature, or into the state of pristine awareness, as it's called in the Dzogchen tradition, for example. And some of the higher levels of practice in Buddhism and Hinduism, they always point back into this fundamental pure consciousness, pure awareness state. So I discovered the senses, if you did not become attached to them, but instead follow them back into where they provided a foundation for discovering that field of awareness within which everything in this world of the senses arises, they could actually point out a very deep level of pure consciousness. And so I began to integrate that as part of what I offered to people during the preparatory training before they did a vision quest or a sacred passage.
And what were you looking for? Because you had deep experiences with your shamanic tradition and then with Vipassana, and yet you were exploring all these different traditions. So what was I guess my question would be, what was the vision that you were searching for, or what was your quest?
Well, because I had been so involved in helping birth the environmental movement in the 60s, I was still continuing with that lifelong practice of going alone into nature for extended periods of time, up to a month. I did my first month-long retreat when I was 15 years old in the mountains of the Olympic Peninsula. So I was really interested, not just in the science behind the science of ecology that was behind the environmental movement, but I understood that it would be very important to give people the experience of being connected to nature as a foundation for the environmental movement, and also for their well-being and their happiness and joy. And for myself personally, of course, it provided me personally with many answers. I was very, like many people in those days, I was very concerned about the destruction of the environment. The rivers where I grew up were terribly polluted. Some of the rivers, like the Passaic River in New Jersey, you could actually put a match in them and they would light fire. That's how polluted they were. And so the air was polluted in the cities, the water was polluted in the rivers and lakes. The environment was heavily contaminated with things like pesticides. The wilderness and wild areas were being destroyed right, left, and center. And I realized that as part of the environmental unfoldment, we would have to come into a re-understanding of who we were in relationship to nature. And the foundation of that was to honor the senses, to honor this amazing gift of this body that we're given in this lifetime, and all the experiential foundation that this body provides. And that gave me a foundation to explore what we now call the 9 fields of experience. Sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and then the experience of movement and balance that goes along with movement. The exploration of the energy body, the chakras and the acupuncture meridians of the body, for example. And then, of course, the emotional body that is such a core part of our lives and our experience of life. And then the way in which we deal with the mind and with thoughts. And so these 9 experiential fields of sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, balance, and movement, energy patterns, and the movement of emotions and thoughts became the way in which I began to explore how people could connect to their bodies, and then through their bodies in these experiential fields to broader nature itself, and began to refine how we could use those 9 experiential fields to connect deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, so that after a while you began to have the experience of being completely one with nature. And then ultimately you could follow all those 9 fields back into the base of pure awareness, pure consciousness, which is the foundation of all of us. And so that really opened up a pathway to what I now call the awareness training component of the way of nature. We now subsume all those kinds of practices under what we call the awareness training part of our process.
And what is the purpose or the orientation with which people come to an awareness training? What is the question that they're trying to answer?
Well, I think, I believe last time we shared in the previous podcast, I mentioned that three of the core questions that people come here for are, who am I at the deepest level? What am I here for? What is the purpose of this lifetime? And am I in deep harmony with that deep purpose for this lifetime? So the questions of where am I, who am I, and am I fulfilling my deep purpose for this life are some of the core issues that people bring to a passage when they engage. A number of people also come with the question, I really feel out of connection with nature and life itself and the reality of this universe. I would like to have a direct experience of what this amazing universe truly is, what underlies it, what's my part in this, what role am I playing in this cosmos, this unfoldment of the cosmos, what is my authentic relationship to the sacred, to the divine view, to spiritual view, and whatever term you may use, it might be God or Goddess or Allah, or it would depend on your cultural background, but what is my relationship to the deepest levels of a sacred perspective? Many people come with that feeling and also a feeling of being disconnected from an authentic connection, also to nature, and they understand, particularly in these days, that without an authentic connection to nature, it's very hard to engage in dealing with issues like climate change, for example.
And when you say nature, in Way of Nature teachings, you talk about the inner nature, the outer nature. Could you please give
Sure.
a summary of that framework?
Yeah, if you take that word nature, actually it's a beautiful word because it really can represent both the world of the environment, outer nature, and this amazing display of the plants and the animals, and the stones and the elements of earth, air, water, fire, and space, and wood. All these amazing elements that we find in the outer environment, the outer natural systems of the planet and the cosmos. So that's outer nature. And of course, we perceive outer nature through this embodied set of those 9 fields of experience. We touch into that outer nature through our inner nature, which is made up of course, the physical body. It's made up of those 9 fields of experience, of sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, balance, and movement, energy, emotions, and thoughts. And from birth to death, we encounter this outer world of life and nature and community and loved ones and so on through this opening of the inner nature aspect. So the inner nature really acts as an intermediary between the outer and the deepest level of what we call the true nature, which is the third type of nature. True nature aspect, or source nature aspect, is most clearly identified with the pure awareness, pure consciousness aspect, which is a base of pure beingness, pure awareness, that underlies all the 9 experiential fields. In other words, none of those sensorial fields, for example, can manifest if there is not a field of awareness that could hold them. Now, normally we spend our lifetimes completely caught up in the experience of the inner nature and the outer nature aspect. And we rarely turn things around so we become aware of awareness itself, or we become conscious of consciousness itself. But in the way of nature, we provide the invitation to take a deeper look into the deepest level of nature, your nature, which is your true nature. And so those are the 3 natures, the outer, the inner, and the true. that we work with. And the other thing that's important to say is that the ability to connect to those three levels of nature, outer, inner, and true, can only function properly if they are free of blockages and obscurations which build up through the experiences of life. If you have experiences of fear and anger and grief and sadness, for example, all those create certain kinds of subtle and sometimes not so subtle blockages, which then stand in the way of experiencing those three natures very clearly. So part of the job of the way of nature is to help clarify and in a sense, transform those blockages into a free energy and a free and open, clear awareness, which then allow you to experience the three natures with clarity and openness.
And when you go deeper and deeper into the source awareness that you speak of, can you give people an instance of how your experience is slightly different? For instance, like whatever I have observed a little bit of this work, I feel like you lose that sort of surface level agitation of thoughts, for instance, and you find this deeper level of stillness, almost like an ocean where you have the waves and the froth, and you started experiencing it from a depth. Uh, why is living from source so powerful and important?
Well, I think one of the reasons it's so powerful is it's the foundational level of our being. And at that level of our being, really nothing disturbs it. Pure awareness, pure consciousness is in a state of absolutely a pure and open and clear. It's at a pure, open, and clear state. And to the degree we can begin to return to that, we start to reconnect with a state of fundamental clarity, openness, joy, a basic fundamental happiness of being in this lifetime. And also we find a place where we're not caught up in either the distractions or the attractions and contractions of life. The Buddhist tradition, for example, puts a great deal of emphasis on how important it is not to get caught up in the attachments of life. If we get too caught up in having a really beautiful car, the perfect husband or the perfect wife, the ideal family, having lots of money, being a success in the eyes of our peers, we become attached to those things, then we open ourselves up to immense amounts of suffering when those things change and disappear or go away. That's why the first principle that we talked about last time is so critical. Unless you get the realization that everything is a state of change, all the forms of life, then you're bound to go through some kind of suffering as they transform, as they change. And so if you shift the identification of oneself from these outward forms that you become attached to, which then cause suffering because you're so attached to them, or you're caught up in the fear of what might happen again that's terrifying or fearsome, or something you're angry at, if you're extroverting the blockage. In all of those cases, you're caught up in the outer world of experience. And you're ignoring this fundamental world, which is essentially joyful, peaceful, and clear, and open and spacious. So to the degree you can return to that, even if you may not make a fully liberated, fully enlightened return to that state, even the movement in that direction begins to bring more harmony, more peace, more tranquility, and a more peaceful life.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. When I initially had intellectually read about these things, they are very beautiful concepts and they sound really things that one would desire. But once you start getting a flavor of it, the kind of clarity that it brings in your life, where you might do something which is completely out of time, space, culture, you're no longer influenced by the fashion or what your peers are doing, and you know what exactly you need to do as you move through life, which has been such a fascinating experience for me. Could you comment a little bit on how this is slightly a different orientation than some other parts? So a lot of traditional Zen and Buddhism have this concept of abiding in emptiness and going towards source. But that orientation is more renunciate. It's sort of not as integrated into the world, but in Way of Nature, there's this idea of acting from source. It's not just about going on the top of a mountain like a Taoist master or a Buddhist monk, but it's more of acting from source. So could you comment on that difference and how you came up with that integration process?
Yeah. Well, I think part of the difference that you find between the Way of Nature and some of these more classical pathways is that there's a full embrace of this life, being in this body, in this time, in this way, and actually the embrace of those experiential fields I mentioned earlier, those 9 fields of experience. There's not a denial of them, but there is a caution that if you become attached to these experiences that have come up through your lifetime, or if you become identified with pushing them away, becoming contracted and blocked because they're fearful or unpleasant, and you become addicted to either the attachments or the aversions, you can get lost in these fields of experience. And we're all familiar with how we suffer when we lose the loved one, or how we become angry if a relationship kind of goes sour, and then you begin projecting all the faults on the other, on the former loved one. And the flip from the loved one to the averse one happens very quickly. It's amazing. There's actually quite a connection between those two, we often discover. So if you follow the pathway to the 3 natures, then part of your refinement process is to also take the dive not just into outer nature and honoring that and this bodily nature that we live life through, but you also have the opportunity or the invitation to go deep into that nature of your pure beingness. And to the degree that you accomplish that, you realize a certain kind of fundamental freedom. You're no longer addicted or caught up completely in the display of the senses and the emotions and the mental patterns. You see them all as arising from this tremendously deep, creative essence of yourself, which you even hear calling true nature. And as I said before, to the degree that you enter that level of being, you accomplish some level of freedom or liberation, and you're no longer subject to the suffering and the pain that goes along with attachment and aversion both.
So that sounds really lovely, and I guess this would be a good segue to talk about the principle of commitment to awakening, right, and liberation. Why this is obviously very important, and can you tell us how Way of Nature principles talk about this process?
Sure. But one last thing I should mention along with the attachment and aversion aspect. One of the reasons that they can become so powerful is that we tend in our lifetimes to ignore our true nature. So in both the Buddhist and the Taoist tradition, they often say that the 3 fundamental causes of suffering are attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And when I first heard that word ignorance, well, what does that mean? And then I broke the word out like I often like to do. I love looking at the languaging. And I realized it's ignorance means that you're ignoring something. Well, what are you ignoring? You're ignoring your true nature. So when you no longer ignore your true nature, but you actually surrender into it and begin to drop into that field of very open, spacious, clear beingness, the freedom begins to arise, and the joy naturally begins to arise, and the basic happiness begins to arise. And you're no longer completely identified with the attachments and the aversions and the suffering that go along with that. So these 3 seed issues of attachment, aversion, and ignorance are at the very heart of the great traditions, and we also adhere to that as well. But what makes us a little different is that we also see that the pathway of the experience of this lifetime these 9 fields of experience of sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, balance, movement, emotions, thoughts, and energy perception. This provides a display that often gives you a beautiful, joyful experience. It's a very creative experience of life. If we didn't have those things, there would just be a big zero. So in a way, part of the joy of this lifetime is enjoying the creative display that arises from your true nature and from source and unfolds in this amazingly magical display of nature and of community and of this lifetime. And so from that standpoint, we honor the 9 experiential fields. Yes, they can be a source of attachment or aversion, and therefore ignorance, because we ignore our true nature, because we just identify with these experiences. But we then just being attached or deny or caught up in aversion with these experiences and taste that true nature aspect of ourselves, then of course we're free of the issues around being complete of a complete immersion in the 9 fields. But if we can turn those fields around and fall them back into the field of beingness that allows them to display, then we begin to actually have the possibility of liberation through falling the fields back into where they arise, where they manifest, and ultimately back into which they dissolve when they're finished. And from that standpoint, we really honor a fully embodied experience of this lifetime. But we do that because we've begun to explore how we can enjoy this lifetime and appreciate the uniqueness of it and the creativity of it without becoming attached or averse, caught up in attachment, aversion, or ignorance of our true nature. So that gives us the freedom to really enjoy and appreciate the gift of this lifetime and the creativity of it. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that to the degree that you can take a deep dive into your true nature, that is also the field of immense creativity. If you're working in a field like the arts or in science, or let's say you have a business where you're searching for some new ideas, some creative new insights on how to do a better job with your company, this is pure gold. To the degree that you approach source, your true nature aspect, immense creativity begins to arise. And a lot of the work that I do with my students, one of the things we focus on is how to really honor and bring to life that deep levels of creativity and the arising of pure creativity that is often perfectly appropriate for what's arising in the now, in the circumstances of your life, in this lifetime. And that creativity is pure gold, whether you're an artist, a business person, or somebody just looking for a creative way to unfold your relationship with others. So I've noticed in listening to a number of teachers that they often forget to mention this field of pure creativity that often comes as an immense gift from a deep immersion in the pathway to source and to the true nature. But it should be mentioned, it should be emphasized, because it's, again, part of the gift of this life and helps this life become even more complete and more integrated. And we put quite a bit of emphasis on that in the way of nature. And we help individuals, organizations, and so forth, and leaders tap into that creativity, which is absolutely pure gold for what they're coming up against in their lifetimes.
Which is probably one of the sources for the answers to what your purpose is and what you should do next, right?
And the precision of how you are responding in this lifetime to the circumstances that are coming up for you, once you've got past the blockages of attachment and aversion, then you suddenly begin to receive the gold that comes from touching into your true nature, the pure creativity that begins to arise from that touching down deep into the essence and the truth of your deepest level of being.
And why is commitment so important for this process?
I'm sorry?
The commitment, which is part of the second principle, why is that super important? Can you maybe give
yes. I think last time we talked a bit about one of the early things that I discovered in following these beautiful pathways of Taoism, Zen, Buddhism, with the Theravada and Mahayana systems, and then of course the incredible systems of the Hindu culture, and then the shamanic systems from all over the planet. In all these cases, there seemed to be a certain common ground of cultivation and opening these three natures. And the common ground I distilled into a series of what we call the 12 principles. And these 12 principles are a common ground pathway that you find in virtually all cultures on that journey into the complete realization of those three natures and their connectivity. So I think last time when we talked, we shared a bit about the first principle of all the forms are changing, all the form aspects of life are interconnected at some level, certainly at the quantum level. And all these form aspects are also arising from pure source, manifesting the field, then dissolving back into that. That was the first principle, because the truth of that needs to be incorporated before you even begin the path. And then you begin to unfold the path to discover if this is true. And if it is true, how can we work with this to live a more joyful and liberated life, a more happy life, a life of deeper truth. And so the second step, once you've really begun to incorporate that first principle, I highly recommend as practice for folks that they go out and contemplate that first principle as a starter. Just spend a little time in nature and notice how everything that you perceive, that you experience, is subject to continuous change. And then if you go back deep into that level of where all these form aspects of the beauty of nature are arising in you as an experience, you'll notice there's a unifying field of being, of consciousness, that provides a kind of unifying field that holds all these diverse forms of nature that are changing. And so you begin to touch into both the unification and the constant change aspects of that first principle of all form. And just a simple contemplative practice to explore them. By contemplation, I mean you don't become obsessively caught up in thinking. You may have a seed thought come up, like the idea of all the form aspects I'm perceiving through my senses are constantly shifting and altering and changing. And as you contemplate that, then you let go of the idea of the seed thought and you just open to experience and see how true is that. And you allow the openness of the mind and of the awareness to reveal maybe some new insights and thoughts around what you're contemplating. And you go deeper and deeper in the process of investigation like that. And that process is called contemplation. It's a very powerful practice and is a companion to meditation. It's it's really using both all the faculties of the mind, the intuition, the rational mind, and the capacity of the mind to drop into a very meditative place and tap into that, touching into that pure creativity I mentioned earlier. When all those come together, that produces a process of contemplation.
How is it different from thinking? Because I think many of the listeners might not be able to. We are in this society just stuck in thinking processes. So maybe you can differentiate that.
Thinking is where if you watch somebody that's really caught up just in thinking, their mind is on kind of a speed trip. They usually talk pretty fast. They're in a continuous state of providing thought as a continuous stream of something. And there's not much space in their communication. Somebody who's communicating well, also in a state of contemplation, they move through the thoughts, but they pause. They give some space for the creativity of the fresh and they are to arise in the process of sharing. So that's an example of how contemplation is different than just speed thinking. And today, because people kind of tend to get caught up in faster cars, faster computers, faster everything, I came up with a little saying a few years ago: speed wastes time. You can quote me on that. And speed wastes time. And by that, I don't mean the chemical speed only, but speed itself, the addiction to speed. Fast thought, fast cars, fast computers, faster 5G phones. All this stuff represents a fundamental distrust of life. We've got to capture it. We've got to get it before it goes. Actually, the paradox there is that you get it better by slowing down and stopping and allowing the moment. I think last time we got together, I called that the oment, to allow the oment of the moment to truly arise, where you drop into the state of very, very pure nounness in a very relaxed way. And the beauty and the joy of that experience can flower. When you're on a speed trip, it's very hard for that to happen. And so slowing down and learning how to move at a much more relaxed pace is very helpful in opening up otherwise hasty and anxious states of mind. Speed trippers, mental speed trippers, are usually very anxious. There's a level of distrust and deep contraction in them that they've never quite resolved. And they lose a lot of the joy of life because they're so addicted to the speed. If you can slow down and enjoy the journey, enjoy the trip, there's nothing like a good relaxed walk in the woods or a slow canoe trip down a beautiful river. It's very different than being in a speedboat. And of course, there's a rush that comes from speed, but and that's a fine thing to enjoy for a moment. But if you become addicted to that rush, then you're on a speed trip and you've lost the capacity to have a refined experience of life. Let me give you an example. If you're on a motorboat and you're rushing across a beautiful lake, you may be having a wonderful experience of the speed of that boat and the big waves being tossed up and so on and so forth. But if you go back and you take a similar trip in a canoe, and you're canoeing across that beautiful body of water, very slow and very relaxed, suddenly you notice the beautiful water lilies that before you didn't even notice, these beautiful flowers that appear alongside your canoe with beautiful pink petals, beautiful golden center with the stamens and the pistil. Oh, you begin to refine your awareness of where you were passing before. On such a speed trip, you notice nothing except the speed and the high waves you're tossing up. Now, if you might stop the canoe for a moment and you just rest there in that canoe in the openness of the lake, you might have the experience of the beauty of the flowers, the beauty of the waves, the beauty of resting in a state of openness, vastness, and space. And it might support you going deeper into a state of inner stillness, inner spaciousness, inner clarity, which would have been absolutely impossible with the speedboat, and which you also didn't quite get even when you were canoeing more slowly. But when you're resting there in a very still space of the canoe, just resting there in the open lake, and then you go a little bit deeper and you begin to discover that that stillness of the canoe, the stillness of your being in that canoe, surrounded by this vastness of the open waters, allows you to drop into this wonderful state of a very quiet and peaceful and still consciousness and mind. And then through that, you begin to touch into the fundamental clarity and openness and vastness and spaciousness of the pure awareness, pure consciousness aspect of your true nature. And with that comes a great joy and a great tranquility.
Fascinating. And I think you touched upon two very interesting points there. One, was the fundamental distrust of life. And I think we often have this tendency to jump to the next thing.
Yeah.
We want the latest phone and we just want it so we can say we have the latest phone, and 5 minutes later we want the next thing. And I often wonder if there was a fast forward button to life, how many people would actually press it and just move forward. Can you talk a little bit about why this fundamental distrust exists? Uh, Somehow, when I've reflected on this, to me, it feels like it has something to do with the fear of mortality in some way, which is why I'm also quite interested in how this connects to the second principle of committing to liberation in this lifetime. So it would be really nice to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, when we pause to really experience life at a little bit deeper level and some of that basic tranquility, one of the first things that arises is anything that stands in the way of entering that state of tranquility and clarity and spaciousness. So you might suddenly begin to become aware of the fundamental anxieties, contractions, and aversions that were hidden under the surface of your being when you're moving more quickly and more fast. The moment you begin to slow down, then those inner angsts begin to have a bit of space to show their face. And it could be the fear of death. It also could be the sense of the ego that it's no longer the boss, that this is a much bigger experience this lifetime than just the experience of the ego and personal power. All kinds of things can begin to arise if you give this opportunity for space and clarity and slowness to happen. So with the way of nature, we emphasize the fact that part of the path is to go deep into the stillness, the silence, and the space, but also to begin to honor the fears, the blockages, and the obscurations that will arise as soon as you begin to give them the opportunity and the space to show their true face again. And so we have a number of ways that we embrace those anxieties, those contractions, and those distractions in a skillful way. So it begins to free those patterns up, and you go deeper into pure spaciousness, stillness, silence, and space. And that process is really the third and fourth principles of relaxation and presence. When you master relaxation and presence, of course, all those contractions, distractions, and forms of ignorance begin to naturally dissolve because they're not fundamentally true. They're not really the fundamental true aspects of your being. The fundamentally true aspects of your being are clarity, space, stillness, silence, a vast and peaceful and tranquil way of being. So we put quite a bit of emphasis on developing the skills of relaxation and presence to help and support the process of transmuting, honoring, transforming, transmuting the blockages as they arise.
And I think this was, one of the reasons why I find that it's such an integrative path. Rather than saying we will get away from possibilities where, desire and aversion is going to arise and sort of go to the top of a mountain, we are, and you use the word honoring these impurities and sort of learning to transform them, which makes sure that we are able to actually operate in the world. We are able to do jobs and we are able to have relationships while being connected to the source.
Yeah.
What would be very interesting is also then to connect back to your other point, which is you spoke about the canoe, and that resonates because a lot of the times when you feel the contractions, for me, for some reason, often going to the beach and seeing the sea or a water body has often been a very, very supportive activity. And I would like to, hear your comments on how different facets and forms of nature may resonate for different people under different emotions, and how they can be supportive when it might be hard to sort of just sit down and sort of feel that source. how nature can assist you in accessing that spaciousness?
Absolutely. we we recognize that there are a number of elements that come into supporting a deep and powerful retreat experience, for example. One of them is authentic teachings. Another is being with a teacher who has gone deep enough with what's being taught to be able to transmit that energetically through the thoughts and through the process of sharing, and even at a level of pure spirit. And then, of course, another great support is being in a place in nature that has these qualities of inspiration. We sum those up as the power of being in a very special, sacred place in nature. And then we bring in the power of solitude, being alone in nature, where you have the opportunity to allow nature, outer nature, to begin to speak to you clearly in the silence of itself. And there's no longer any human chatter going on. It's just nature and its beingness. And suddenly that begins to connect with you, and you have a whole different kind of dialogue going on. And then, of course, you have the support of the spiritual community of folks that are maybe sharing this pathway with you together. So when you bring all those elements together, those 6 kinds of pathways or powers, we like to call them the 6 empowerments, there's the possibility for deep exploration of many, many levels of the outer nature, the inner nature, and the true nature. In all of our retreats, there are many kinds, from very simple ones we call the renewal program to a deeper level we call the nature quest, where you actually spend time overnight in nature, to a very deep one like a sacred passage, where you might spend up to a week alone in nature, along with a deep training from your guide. No matter what level you're going through, these fundamental 6 powers or 6 aspects come into play. And the power of a special and inspiring place in nature is definitely one of them. I'll share at the end of our podcast today where I'm sitting right now. We happen to be in Yellowstone, Colorado, in a place that's surrounded by between 4,000 and 5,000 meter mountains, and one of the largest alpine valleys in the Americas, out in front of that range. And you talk about an environment that supports the feeling of space and clarity and light. Wow, when you're here, you live in that. You live in a field of clarity, space, and light, supported by the mountains and the immense vastness of the San Luis Valley that then spreads out from this mountain range. So what a gift it is for Sandy and me to live in an environment like this, where we're supported every day, every hour, by this kind of vastness, clarity, and space. So yes, it's extremely supportive. And if you can live in an environment like that without taking it for granted, wow. If you're not able to live in an environment like that, then you can take periodic retreats to places like that. I know many people do that. They call it a vacation. But if you go there with a spiritual kind of intent as well, then it's called a pilgrimage. And we strongly support the idea of pilgrimage for that reason. And when you go on pilgrims, you go to these places because they're immensely supportive and inspiring. And you can drop into that stillness, that silence, and that spaciousness of being in those places with their support. So most of the programs that we do, particularly the sacred passages, we hold them in places that have that quality of inspiration and a kind of spiritual potency of nature. And we actively honor that. We give thanks for that to spirit and nature. In fact, lately I've been helping put together an idea for a Thanksgiving concert for Mother Nature, for Mother Earth, from the human species. Wouldn't it be beautiful to have a concert where we gave thanks back to Mother Earth and to all nature and life for the gift of being in this amazing array of all life, and to give it a clear thanksgiving back to all of life for the gift of being here in this time, in this way. If we did that as a species on a regular basis, wow, that would be absolutely culture transforming. So I'm in the process of putting together some ideas around a global concert to do that.
Yeah.
But
That would be fascinating.
yeah, I think it'd be quite something.
Yeah.
Quite something. I'm working with some folks to try to make that actually manifest and happen. And of course, we do need, as Greta Thunberg has made very clear, we need to transform and change within a relatively short period of time. We have basically this decade, at best, to shift from a fossil fuel intensive, pollutive kind of species behavior into one that is based on a life supporting, renewable energy utilizing, recycling kind of behavior as a species, where we begin to behave as like all the other species of the planet in a way of harmony, respect, integration, where the entire system benefits from our presence on this planet. Right now, we're just a massive, functioning more like a massive parasite or cancer. That has to change. It's gone to the point where the entire planet now is in peril because of our behavior. So part of that transformation could be tapping into the power of concerts, prayer, music, and bringing this intention of coming back into harmony with the rest of life by first starting the first step, which is saying thank you, all of life and nature, for the gift of this existence here in this time on this planet, and showing respect and appreciation for that gift for a change. We've hardly ever, I don't think we've ever done that as a species. Individual indigenous cultures do that at the root foundation of their practice. We now need to do this as an entire species. So that's the invitation.
Yeah, I think that's a good practice for even individuals.
Absolutely.
Access
Absolutely.
natural spot and access that gratitude.
Each of us can go out and do that every day. We have a simple, universal ceremony we call the 11 Direction Ceremony, which is our honoring of a ceremonial process that you own. You make that ceremony your own, and then you utilize that as your way of giving honor and thankfulness back to the great mystery of all life and spirit.
Fascinating. So John, I'm very mindful of your time, and I would probably just like to get a few comments on what have you seen the various individuals who have sort of adhered to this second principle, of sort of committing themselves towards liberation and, starting to do nature quests. What kind of changes have you started observing? Maybe you can give the listeners a flavor of the sort of early stages of the path.
Sure. Well, I should mention that if you go to the Way of Nature website, which is www.wayofnature.com, I think there we have the whole 12 principles as one of the things that you can take a look at, and it's under the About Us part of the website. But the reason I'm mentioning that is so you can go in and have a look at the 12 principles as an entire unit. Now, we talked about the first principle at the last podcast and a little bit here, but the second principle is absolutely unique. It basically says, it's a recommendation from me personally to you that you consider committing yourself to full liberation in this lifetime, full realization of everything we've been talking about, the realization of the three natures, for example. And if you really commit yourself, what happens is all the forces of the personality, including the ego, begin to become entrained into the pathway that ends up in the opening of that deep and profound truth. If you do not make that commitment to yourself, then it's much more difficult to open these deep levels of truth and understanding in yourself. So I recommend you make a commitment to your own unfoldment. And I think we phrased it as I commit myself to full liberation in this lifetime for the benefit of all beings, not just for my personal self. So it's a pretty big commitment. You're not making it to an organization or a particular vision of some entity or anything like that. It's a commitment to the realization of fundamental truth. And what that does is activate a whole series of processes in your psyche and in your being, which then help to lead to the realization of that truth. It does mean, to be completely honest, it does also mean that many of the blockages that you've tucked away in your being and your psyche will probably begin to come forth, so you have the opportunity for their transformation in this process. So it's not, I should be clear about that it's not just a joyful journey at all times. There is going to be the embrace of the inner demons that begin to arise because they've been blockages that might have been there for a very, very long time in your being. And we try to honor our inner demons and little critters that are running around and running our psyche. Extremely important to honor those beings, those aspects of ourselves that we've tried to block and push away and not deal with. Bring them to the fore, embrace them, feed them, and then ultimately give them a chance to become truly free parts of our psyche, truly liberated aspects of our psyche. And so that's an integral part of our process. We call that, actually we're doing a 3-year retreat right now where that's what we do. We call it embracing the shadow aspect, exploring and embracing the shadow aspect. And without that, it's almost impossible to become truly liberated in this lifetime. You really have to honor these shadow aspects, and that commitment to full liberation ignites the process of allowing these inner blockages to rise to the surface, where you can begin that process of embrace, honoring, feeding, and ultimately transformation and liberation of those aspects. Very, very important.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect point to close and maybe continue on with the next principles in our next conversation, and also probably do a little bit of a deep dive on the shadow aspects, because that definitely seems very, very interesting. Thank you for your time, John. Much appreciated.
Really enjoyed it.
Speaking to you.
Okay.
Bye.
See you later.